Welcome to another episode on the Chat-olic show. We are extremely glad that you enjoyed the previous episode, and we are very thankful for your words of encouragement. The last time we discussed the historical idea of Lent and why Lent is meant to be a celebration, not a time of mourning or a time when we are sad and we are not supposed to do certain things. We also saw how Lent is supposed to be a journey where we journey with our friends and our family towards this joyful day of Easter. Here today we are going to discuss the three pillars that form the celebration of Lent, and that is prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. And to discuss these once again, we have with us Father Gavin. Father, thank you for joining us again.
Thanks for having me on.
Father, how these three pillars of Lent, the pillars of fasting, almsgiving, and prayer, how these three become so integral part of our Catholic understanding of Lent? There could have been so many other things that could have been, but why has the Church picked on these three to become part of our celebration of Lent?
Rodwin, these three aspects of fasting, of almsgiving, and of prayer are tremendously important to us as Catholics, because it really helps us to analyze our relationship with God and to bring to the fore what is happening inside of us as we go through this period of Lent. As we said the last time, it's a celebration of the grace that God gives to us through the family, through the community. It brings into focus this great need to be with God. So these three behaviors, if you may call them, of fasting, of giving alms, and of prayer help us to rediscover this beautiful relationship in a very intense manner. If you look at many other religions, also have all three aspects related very close to the experience of the divine. We find that somehow or the other, if one wants to put oneself into an experience with the divine, one begins to fast, one begins to pray, and almsgiving is almost like a natural response that comes out of this experience. So yes, Catholic theology is very, very closely looks at these three behaviors as closely connected to this period of Lent.
So is it true that our practice of prayer, almsgiving, and fasting draws us and makes us more into the image and the likeness of God?
Yeah, let's look at this whole concept of the image and likeness of God, because this is theologically a very heavy concept. When we say the image and likeness of God, it helps to understand that we were made completely in God's image and likeness. But what is this image and likeness that we are talking about? We go back to that first moment in which God decides in the Trinity, let us make man in our image and likeness. In that moment of absolute generosity where God gives himself completely to the making of man, woman, and in that act he generously empties himself into his creation, into this whole act where he's so generous that he entrusts himself literally. If you look at the book of Genesis, God walks with Adam and Eve in the garden. God is with them, God is one with them, and it's this intense giving and love that is seen at that moment. This is a moment where God, in his generosity, embarks on this journey of total self-giving. When we talk about almsgiving, when we talk about prayer, when we talk about fasting, it is this act of total self-giving. So we are built in the image of God who does this for us.
Let's unpack this a little bit more.
Sure.
Because when we say that we are imitating God when we are praying, when we are fasting, or when we are giving alms, in the book of Genesis we see that yes, God walks with his people. He's there. He's there with them every moment. But how is it that we don't say that God prays? No, we don't say that God fasts. We don't say that God gives alms. So how is this connected to our unity with God, or becoming one, or as Jesus says, be perfect like the Heavenly Father is perfect. So how does this fit into us becoming like Jesus?
Let's look at the scriptures to understand this, because when you say that God does not pray, or God does not fast, or God does not give alms, indeed, fasting, almsgiving, and prayer are more human behavior than they are you don't attribute them directly to God. But you see that three of these stem from the generosity that God has, that God actually first gave to us. And so in the book of Genesis, you see creation, and along with creation, even after man has decided to kind of, chart his own course without being connected with God, God never leaves man's side. He's there with Adam, Eve, and with every successive generation of humankind. He's there with them in the roughness of life. And we see that the roughness of life puts man into this day-to-day activity, and he keeps adding experiences, and with each of these experiences he puts himself kind of at a distance from God, and he fails to recognize the beauty of God's love within him. And we see that God chooses patriarchs, and with each of the patriarchs his generosity comes to the fore. And he tells them, especially in the prophets, God reminds them of this generosity. You'll find Prophet Amos, Prophet Ezekiel, Prophet Isaiah telling the people of Israel, if you really want to please God, if you want to make a sacrifice that is pleasing to him, then you must give him a humble, contrite heart. Then you must give him your praise. Then you must give him the moment in which your society is completely transformed into a giving society. Do not sell the poor for a pair of sandals. You lie on couches of ivory while people starve. You wait for your feasts and your new moons to get over so that you can start selling your wares. He warns them about this hypocritical kind of a relationship that they have with God. So yes, you don't see God actually praying or giving alms or fasting, but you see God locked into a relationship with us where for our sake he's literally so in love with us, so madly and deeply he desires us so much that he puts himself into a vulnerable position.
Very often the fasting becomes the goal. The goal is I'll eat breakfast and I'll directly eat maybe something for tea or something for dinner. So the goal becomes, after I've had the breakfast, to manage not eating until supper or not eating something until tea. So we've lost the idea of, oh gosh, that now it's not the idea of what I'm missing, but who I am being with, the presence of God,
exactly.
the joy that I'm going to encounter.
When we spoke the last time of making it a communitarian exercise of fasting, or making it an exercise of an accompaniment through fasting, I was pointing towards this, that fasting becomes a moment of accompanying. Literally, God accompanies me, or I accompany my neighbor or my brother in need. Fasting, almsgiving, and prayer is just the same. To feel accompanied, to feel this deep relationship with the other, rather than just to feel the pain of giving something away that you love. In fact, St. Ambrose says this, the food that you have in excess in your cupboard belongs to another. And the joy you will get when you make this food reach its actual destination is a joy of having loved God and of God having loved you first. So it's not the action that really counts, it's the action that acts like a vehicle to take you back to that moment of feeling loved, feeling purely enveloped by God's love. So these are not necessarily ends in themselves. Fasting for itself, almsgiving for itself, or praying for itself. It always has this relational value. Going back into the relationship with God, going back into the relationship with your brother and sister, with your world. So it does have that value.
Since we're discussing anyways Lent as a community, or celebrating Lent together as a community with my friends, with my brothers, my sisters, my family, how is it that prayer, fasting and thanksgiving can be done as this as a group of friends or as a group of community? And why does it become easier when we're doing it as a community rather than when we're doing it by ourselves?
Prayer as a community always has this uplifting experience. The people who come to pray together, especially if you've been part of a prayer group or you've been part of a group that decides to come to pray together, by the very fact that you've come together, you make the divine present, because you find this even in scripture, in the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus says to his disciples, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am in the midst of them. So in that prayer itself, you can be sure of this, that communitarian prayer brings the experience of the divine and makes it very tangible. You're there in that moment and you don't know why. But the very sharing of love for God in that moment as a community takes on a life of its own, and it carries you where you've never imagined in that moment. So praying as a community is very beautiful. Also, almsgiving as a community has always been better, in the sense that personal almsgiving, if you're a very rich person, you'd feel nothing when you give to people. But as a community, when you begin to give, it brings to mind what St. Paul says: outdo one another in charity towards each other. And this does not only mean in giving in terms of cash, but in outdoing one another, in loving one another. This brings to the fore a behavior that you do not see normally. It puts you in contact, or it's like a person who otherwise would not fast very easily or would not give alms very easily. It makes it easy for this person to get into that culture, because he is with people who are doing it. And being accompanied by people has a very great psychological as well as a spiritual value. And this magic has to be experienced. I can't explain it to you in words, but when you find an entire community supporting you in this action, it somehow brings something beautiful about in our lives.
The Bible is a story of humankind struggling to understand God, but it's also a story of God who's struggling to reveal himself to us. Because, like you said, we have this love of God, which is at the core of our being, but we've surrounded that with one experience after another. And for some reason or the other, the experience becomes more important, or our daily task or our daily chores become more
absolutely
important than drawing back to the first love. So when we talk of prayer and fasting, at least definitely Thanksgiving is part of it. How is this prayer taking us back to the very core of our being?
Rolvin, when we think of prayer and fasting and almsgiving also, we think of deprivation. That means you've got to take out something that we have, give it away, or stop doing something. Or we think in negative terms, now I have to remove myself from what I do normally, and then try to make my way back to God. This understanding of these three very important actions in our life, this negative connotation that we've added on to these, they take away from the very, very core of this behavior. The core of this behavior lies in my desire to go back to that initial experience of feeling God's grace very actively in my life. Somehow or the other, as I said, as you also rightly pointed out, when I go about my daily chores, my activities, I've got to put food on the table. I've got to make sure that my children eat, or that my children have a good education, or simply that my family survives. So I need to work. I'm constantly committing myself to work, and I think that I express my love to them in this activity. Sometimes I put myself at great stress, so that I'm working almost 18 hours a day and I'm running back and forth. I travel so long, and I expect them to understand my love for them. But it is in this situation that I also deprive them of my presence. I deprive them of my love, my smile, my good word. And in earning all of that survival for them, the money and the wealth that I put together somehow has no meaning for them, because they've missed me all that while. It is the same with God. He doesn't wish for us to
Give up.
To give up that basic understanding that we live not only by bread alone, but on every word that comes from his mouth. And so to long for that kind of a life that puts us within reach of the fullness of life, not of a life that is of comfort, convenience. And therefore fasting, almsgiving, and prayer helps us rediscover that. What is the actual goal of your life? Is it just a bigger car, a bigger house, happier children, well-fed parents? Is it putting together a life where nothing is wrong? Or the perfection of love within each one of us, where we feel wanted and loved? Do you know how many families feel the hurt and pain of dysfunction, and feel the the strain of relationships, parents unable to control kids who have grown unwieldy because of their reaction to what they've seen happening in their houses. And fasting, prayer and almsgiving literally help us to catapult ourselves back into what is primarily important in our lives. This conversation is leaving the shores of well-known fasting. Father, I should not eat on Fridays, and on Wednesdays I shouldn't eat meat. That's abstinence. And I'm going to give up one meal, and I'm going to make sure that I contribute to my favorite charity. I'm going to make sure that I give. Well, these are the externals. The more important part of it is that I'm going to rediscover that generous part of myself that gives my presence to my family, gives my presence to God. So when I'm present to God, I'm there in the action of praying. And even if I don't use too many words, or even if I don't use a book, I'm just there with Him. Probably I might use the scriptures. Probably I might use a meditative posture and a meditative attitude. Probably I might just say, Lord, here I am in your presence. Fill me with your Holy Spirit. That is already the generosity of being present with Him. Another way of being with Him is to be present to those who are in need. So when I'm giving somebody alms, it's not that I'm giving them something that I have. Rather, in that moment, I rediscover the generosity that God has with me in making me. It goes back to that moment in time when God loved me into being, gave me the possibility of breathing on this earth, of seeing it and of being part of it and of being involved with it. And for this reason, I give so that others may have life.
One of the greater debts that we have to repay, we don't have to repay, but it's a good way of saying we are indebted to God for His love. And in a certain way of repaying this debt is to love others in the same way that we would give to God. Often we think that almsgiving would be giving off the extra that I have, or maybe making a small sacrifice in giving it to someone. So I fast and I don't eat on every Friday, and I save that amount, and so that's a sacrifice on my part. But almsgiving goes a lot more deeper than that. It's just not giving of our finances, but it's also the giving of ourselves.
Absolutely. And also the kind of the dissolving of a certain amount of egotistic behavior in our lives. What happens as a result of earning our daily bread, we also begin to earn a kind of an identity, to put on an identity. I begin to know who I am because of what I earn. I begin to know who I am in relationship to others because of what I have, the status that I enjoy. I begin to deal very closely with this identity that I build around myself. The moment of almsgiving, the moment of prayer, the moment of fasting helps me to realize that these are just add-ons. The real me has nothing to do with all of this. I begin to discover that I'm made of more than just what is visible by way of my status, by way of my the identity that I've grown into. This gift of self that we make to others is very, very important and interesting. I just want to give the example of an old age home. When you walk into an old age home, people are just happy that you've come, that you're sitting with them, that you said hello to them, that you smile to them, that you hold their hand and say, "How are you, auntie?" And the kind of joy that is reflected, that really makes you feel something that is intangible, that you can't buy, that you can't force your way into. And that is the moment of prayer, fasting and almsgiving. It makes you feel something so different that if done in the right way, you stop thinking of the pain that it is causing you. Like, hunger. When you feel the pangs of hunger, you just want to run to your fridge and probably pick up a cold drink or a snack and just eat. Well, that's not what fasting is about. It's not so that you feel the pain of the hunger and that you're putting aside money for others. It's so that you feel the joy of being in the presence of God. So they feel the joy of, when I put this food aside and I'm sitting with God and I'm there in that moment, I can focus to such an extent that I can actually feel myself completely in His presence. Now,
celebrating Lent together as a community with my friends, with my brothers, my sisters, my family. How is it that prayer, fasting and thanksgiving can be done as a group of friends or as a group of community? And why does it become easier when we're doing it as a community rather than when we're doing it by ourselves?
prayer as a community always has this uplifting experience. Kind of, the people who come to pray together, especially if you've been part of a prayer group or you've been part of a group that kind of decides to come to pray together. By the very fact that you've come together, you make the divine present, because you find this even in Scripture, in the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus says to his disciples, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am in the midst of them. So in that prayer itself, you can be sure of this, that communitarian prayer brings the experience of the divine and makes it very tangible. You're there in that moment and you don't know why, but the very sharing of love for God in that moment as a community takes on a life of its own, and it carries you where you've never imagined in that moment. So praying as a community is very beautiful. Also, almsgiving as a community has always been better, in the sense that personal almsgiving, if you're a very rich person, you'd feel nothing when you give to people. But as a community, when you begin to give, it brings to mind what St. Paul says, outdo one another in charity towards each other. And this does not only mean in giving in terms of cash, but in outdoing one another, in loving one another. This brings to the fore a behavior that you do not see normally. It puts you in contact, or it's like a person who otherwise would not fast very easily or would not give alms very easily. It makes it easy for this person to get into that culture, because he is with people who are doing it. And being accompanied by people has a very great psychological as well as a spiritual value. And this magic has to be experienced. I can't explain it to you in words, but when you find an entire community supporting you in this action, it somehow brings something beautiful about in our lives.
One of the things that I really liked was the aspect of praying together, because we struggle with our prayer. We live in this world of distraction. Now when 2 or 3 are gathered together, one, God is there, and secondly, we are in a sense accompanying and journeying with each other in this season of prayer. Heather.
Brother Alvin, I'd like to bring to the fore this same aspect of prayer that you're talking about, that you described just now, from a very well-known parable. It is the parable of the prodigal father. I would not say the prodigal son, but the prodigal father. And you see that the father is someone who's waiting every moment for the return of his son. And that is prayer. Why is it prayer? Because there's a deep longing. I want to see my son back. And even when he is halfway home, his father runs to him. That is the longing that prayer brings about. The second aspect is the aspect of giving of himself. The father throws his arms around his son, gives him a nice mantle to wear, puts sandals on his feet. It's a moment of almsgiving because of that beautiful relationship. Puts a signet or a ring on his finger to signify his being elevated as a son. And this culminates all in the togetherness of the evening when they're having a celebration. And this is, in a certain sense, the celebration of prayer, fasting and almsgiving by the Father. Now you'll say there's no fasting here. True, because the Father says, bring the fatted calf, let us slaughter the fatted calf, because my son who was dead has come back to life. And that fatted calf that you see there is the sacrifice that the father offers for this son. The calf takes on that symbolism of being the end of a broken relationship. It signals the end of a son who is desperate because he doesn't have anything to eat, a son who has squandered his wealth, a son who no longer feels like a son but is ready to sell himself off to his father as a slave. It's the end of all of this. And in this, we see that the Eastern Fathers of the Church say that calf is Jesus. And in that moment of total self-giving, the Father sacrifices his own Son in order to enrich the whole of humanity. So you see this beautiful thing of fasting, almsgiving, and prayer all at once in this particular parable. It serves as a beautiful example for Lent. Just as the Father is perfect, we need to perfect our fasting, our almsgiving, and our being available to God.
Any other practical suggestions that we could implement as part of our fasting, prayer, and almsgiving?
One thing that I would really request people is to be able to get into an introspective mode and to be able to see why they need to fast. Don't make it an exercise of habit. Don't make it, I do it every year, so I'm doing it again. Make it an exercise where you invite God to be part of it, so that you would experience Him, so that you would experience yourself, so that you learn to look at yourself with love, rather than look at yourself as I'm a sinner and therefore I need to do this so that I can gain my way into heaven. Well, that's a very sad attitude to have towards prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. Rather, look at the massive grace that surrounds you and look at that grace and respond to it with prayer, fasting, and almsgiving.
Thank you so much, Father, for joining us. We look forward to having you next Tuesday.
God bless, Rolvin. And yeah, we'll be waiting for next Tuesday.